New York Giants rookie quarterback Jaxson Dart is trending towards starting against the Detroit Lions, but should the Giants start him or should they sit him? We've got that and a whole lot more coming up next on the Locked On Giants podcast.
You are Locked On Giants, your daily New York Giants podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Locked On Giants podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, now the number one sports podcast network, your team every day. I'm your host, Patricia Traina, credential member of the New York Giants media for Locked On, as well as for New York Giants on SI, which is where you can find all of my written work. And as always, we welcome on in our Blue Crew community members, our everydayers, our newcomers, and everybody in between. And thank you so much for spending part of your day with us here on the Locked On Giants podcast. And if you made us your first listen of the day, we thank you for that as well. Today's episode of Locked On Giants is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the promo code Locked On NFL to get $20 off your first purchase. All right, Giant fans, happy Friday to everybody. On today's episode, we're going to take a look at the question of whether Jaxson Dart, who is trending in the right direction from the concussion protocol, should he play the rest of the way, at least up until the bye, or should they sit him? There's two schools of thought on that, and we'll look at both. And then in segment 2, I did some research on the defense and just how bad it's been. And I came up with a stat that is just going to blow your mind. All right. It has to do with the efficiency rate of getting off the field and how many times the Giants have gotten off the field in as few plays as possible. So that's segment 2. And then we'll wrap things up in segment 3 with some thoughts about Mike Kafka and his basically what's a 7-game audition for him. What might we see for as terms of further changes down the line? So I have some thoughts on that and some stuff to report to you. So that's what we're going to cover on today's show. Again, welcome on in to everybody. All right. Jaxson Dart, he is trending towards clearing the concussion protocol, and all signs are pointing to him playing against the Detroit Lions. Now, there's two schools of thought here. Some people are saying, yeah, let him play. He needs all the reps he can get. And then there are some who are saying, sit him down until he can figure out how to better protect themselves. So I want to take a look at both of those arguments and then tell you where I stand. All right. So obviously the first one is Jaxson Dart, sit him until at least the bye week, make sure he's fully recovered. Make sure, that he understands the importance of protecting himself as a runner and, just keep showing him examples because apparently he still hasn't learned the difference. I don't necessarily agree with that school of thought. All right. I think that Dart needs all the reps he can get, that they won't hurt him. I think that if he is cleared by the independent neurological consultant, then why hold him back? The thing with Dart, if you really want to teach him, if you will, to avoid being reckless, you've got to remove the threat that is, or the temptation, I should say, for him to be reckless. And I went into True Media to see just how many of Dart's 57 rushing attempts are designed runs or have been designed runs. 32, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, so you have design runs, which are plays that are planned off the RPO. And then, of course, you just have scrambles and stuff like that to kind of, extend the play. So 32 of Dart's 57 rushing attempts this year are designed runs, which is kind of a lot. That's the third most in the league for what it's worth. Now, here's where I think Mike Kafka can help this kid. Mike Kafka is already starting to implement little elements from Kansas City, his time at Kansas City with Andy Reid, where, of course, Kafka worked with Patrick Mahomes. Patrick Mahomes, according to True Media this year, has 48 rushing attempts, but only 3 have been designed runs. So maybe if you're you say, okay, you know what? We're going to leave Jaxson Dart in there. We're going to have him pose the threat of a potential design run. And we'll leave the defense to guess, because leaving the defense to wonder if Dart is going to take off at any given time on a design run, that could be just as good as, actually having him run 4 or 5 times or 6 times or whatever per game. So it becomes a game of chess, if you will, a game of head games that the Giants can play with opponents to force them to continue to account for Jaxson Dart as a potential runner. And that's something that I think they need to do moving forward. They need to cut back on the design runs, and just say, all right, you know what? Maybe Jaxson will run. Maybe he won't. Now, the Giants running backs, they have actually been running the ball well the last, 3 or 4 games, including last week, by the way, without Jaxson Dart in there. Because, Jameis Winston, I don't know that people or defenses are going to view him as big of a threat to run as they would Jaxson Dart. So while I know that, the Giants based their offense on that RPO concept, they were able to still run the ball without Jaxson Dart running and without, a lot of RPOs last week. So I say, in terms of this argument, should the Giants sit Jaxson Dart or should they continue to play him? Play him. Let him get the experience. It can't hurt him. All right. In terms of, as long as you protect him from himself. And the way to do that is to cut back on the design runs. There are other things that you can do if you are creative, which I believe Kafka is, that you can do in order to move the ball, to move the chains. And the Giants, unfortunately, under Brian Daboll, they just went to the well one too many times, and it turned out to ultimately catch up with them. So you got to be smart. If your young quarterback is still learning and you're showing him examples of when to get down, when not to get down, take that temptation away from him until, he develops some kind of a flow or a better feel for things. Remember, he's only, been at this not even a full season. So he's still kind of feeling his way at the pro level. He's trying to feel his way as in terms of the speed of the game, which he's doing a good job of, in terms of, the intensity, the strength of the opposing defensive players, which is, several steps above what he faced in college. So you could still have him out there. I don't agree with the concept, sit him until the bye week. Well, with that argument, sit him for the rest of the year if that's what you're going to go with. But it's not going to help him. So you have to find a happy medium. I think the answer to the debate, start him or sit him, you start him, but you change up what you ask of him. His job should be to throw the ball. If you want to have him, use his legs to extend a play because he's under pressure in the pocket, fine. You want to use him to do maybe 1 or 2 design runs during the course of the game. Okay, I can see that, but not 6 or 7 or however many per game. That's just ridiculous. So that, I think, is the happy medium, the solution to the question regarding Jaxson Dart, regarding the recklessness that he tends to show, or I should say the fearlessness. I shouldn't really say recklessness, and just, finding a happy balance on offense. All right, Giant fans, coming up next, the defense. I feel like we talk about this every day, but I did some research. I found some alarming stats. I'm going to tell you what they are and why they're relevant right after this. Hey, Giant fans, this episode is brought to you by Prize Picks. You and I make decisions every day, but on Prize Picks, being right can get you paid. Don't miss any of the excitement of this sports season. Whether you're following the NFL, the NBA, or both, there's no better time to jump in on the action. If you haven't tried it yet, Prize Picks is the simplest way to play. Just pick more or less on at least 2 player stats, and if you get them right, you win. It takes less than 60 seconds to make your lineup, and you can play anywhere Prize Picks operates, including California, Texas, and Georgia. The new Stacks feature is a game changer. You can now pick more or less on any player stat, and if one of your players should leave early with an injury, the injury reboot saves your lineup from a loss. Download the Prize Picks app today and use the promo code LOCKEDONNFL to get $50 in lineups after you play your first $5 lineup. Again, that's code Locked On NFL for $50 in lineups after you play your first $5 play. Prize Picks, it's good to be right. All right, Giant fans, welcome back to Locked On Giants. I'm your host, Patricia Traina. Coming up, obviously, Sunday, we'll have takeaways from the Giants game at Detroit. Not expecting a win, guys. I'm sorry. I know that sounds like I'm a downer, but I'm being realistic here. But, you never know. That's why you line up and you play the game. And then, of course, next week we have a short week. We've got, obviously, Thanksgiving on Thursday. So we'll have crossover Thursday, but we probably won't have a show on Friday for you, just so I get some time off on Thanksgiving. All right, let's get into segment 2 now. We've been talking about this on the show now, I think literally every week, the Giants defense and just how bad it's been. And there's a stat that I was curious about that I wanted to look up and just kind of see where the Giants stood in terms of the rest of the league. That stat is how many 3-and-outs have the Giant defense forced? Now, there's 2 elements here to this particular stat. There is a 3-and-out in which the Giants didn't allow any first downs or a touchdown. And then there's a 3-and-out in which the opponent ran 3 plays and then punted. So I'm going to give you the stats for both. All right. The Giants, in terms of 3-and-outs in which the opponent has not recorded a first down or a touchdown, the Giants have forced 25.4% of their drives into that category. That is ranked 28th in the NFL. In terms of straightforward 3-and-out, 3 plays and a punt, 16.1%, which is ranked 27th in the NFL. Not good, folks. Now, overall, the Giants on third down conversions, they have allowed opponents to convert 40% of the time. That is tied for 18th in the NFL. So that being said, for comparison purposes, let me just tell you about the Lions real quick. The Lions, who the Giants faced this weekend, they have allowed no first downs or touchdowns on the 3-and-out situations, 39.5%. All right, so they're a little bit better in that regard. That is ranked 3rd in the NFL, by the way. And in terms of straightforward forcing 3-and-outs, 3 plays and a punt, the Lions are ranked 7th, having allowed 23.7% of the drives against them to fall into that category. All right. So that kind of gives you like a little measurement to know from the bottom to, a team that's closer to the top of the league in that category. Now, here's what's interesting about the Giants defense. This week, former Northwestern head coach Pat Fitzgerald has been in attendance at the Giants practices. He was there on Wednesday. He was there on Thursday. And Pat Fitzgerald, of course, is a mentor of Mike Kafka, interim head coach. But here's what I'm wondering. Obviously, the Giants coaches in the past, they've invited, colleagues from the CFL, different leagues, high school, college, whatever, to come and watch practices. I can't help but wonder, especially given how Kafka talked about early in the week, he talked about different drills and stuff that they wanted to kind of, work with the players on to get them to perform better. I wonder if maybe Fitzgerald is kind of acting as a pseudo consultant, if you will. Maybe he's watching the defensive practice, and afterwards he and Kafka are having a conversation about what he saw, what he recommends, that sort of thing. And that in turn is getting passed on from Mike to Shane Bowen. That would not surprise me, folks, because look, Mike has been tied up basically since he's been with the Giants on the offensive side of the ball. He is still kind of getting a feel for what the defensive side does, even though, they practice against it and he knows, the different plays and what to look for and stuff like that. In terms of the nuances of the defensive side of the ball, Mike Kafka is still learning that. So Pat Fitzgerald, who is primarily a defensive-minded coach, is probably filling in some of those gaps for him and is probably giving him some advice, like I said, in terms of what they could be doing differently. So then what does this mean for Shane Bowen? Well, folks, as much as I'm going to keep pounding the table for it, I don't think he's getting fired. At this point, it's so late in the season. The Giants, if they lose this weekend, and there's a pretty good chance that they will be the first team to be mathematically eliminated from the postseason, right? And it's not even Thanksgiving yet. And, there's other things that have to happen. I think a Dallas win is one. I think a Seattle win is one. But the Giants, they'll be eliminated if they lose this weekend in terms of the mathematical equation. So at that point, it's not like you say, okay, let's make a change because we need to make a change. You might as well run out the rest of the season with what you got, because you know that they're going to get swept out anyway. Shane Bowen's not going to be back next year. A lot of the defensive coaches probably will not be back next year. So, I know it sounds like you're kind of throwing in the towel by saying, just let him run out the string. But what good is the change going to do? I'm not going to sit here and say that the Giants are going to tank, because I know John Mara does not approve of it. I don't approve of tanking. But at this point, why make any more wholesale changes? The time to have changed the defensive staff, the defensive coordinator, was after that Denver loss. And they didn't do it then. They stuck with him. The schemes, the problems, they're still going on. Not all of it is on the schemes and the coach. Some of it is on the execution by the players. But at this point, what are you going to change? It's too late. That's like closing the barn door after the horse escaped. So it's just, unfortunately, not going to happen. Giant fans, we're going to have to, it looks like at any rate, we're going to have to roll with Shane Bowen and this defensive staff the rest of the way. Now, it's interesting, if you guys saw my show the other day with Sean O'Hara, we were talking about the run defense. And Sean spoke about, how the loss of Micah McFadden back in week 1 has been an underrated but very huge development for the run defense, because Micah McFadden was pretty solid against the run. And since then, the Giants really haven't had a good inside linebacker duo. They had Bobby Okereke, who, is decent enough, but no true partner in crime for Bobby Okereke. And that has been part of the problem, as has, of course, guys not getting off their block, poor angles. Sean mentioned, for example, some of the poor angles taken by the safeties in the defensive secondary. So there's so many things that have contributed to the defense being poor. But it also starts with the defensive coordinator, what he's asking guys to do. Is he asking them to do too much? For example, on today's squad show, the Thursday squad show, the Giants squad show that I do with Mark Collins and Jay Berman, we talked about that. We talked specifically about Abdul Carter. And I said that Abdul Carter, if Kayvon Thibodeau doesn't play again this week, which I'm not so sure if he's going to because of the shoulder injury he has, now you have an opportunity for Abdul Carter to do less things. And, I get it. The coaching staff, they dump a lot on a rookie's plate to see where they're going to fit in, what their niche is. But I've always thought that was the wrong approach to take with regards to a rookie, because you're drafting him because he did something or a couple of things well. Why now all of a sudden are you asking him to do 50 other things that maybe he doesn't do as well or doesn't know how to do? So I'm curious to see if maybe that changes, if maybe they scale back what they asked Abdul Carter to do and let him get comfortable to where maybe he can contribute a little bit more. But bottom line, folks, the defense has been a disaster. And I'll say it again, the talent is a lot better than the results. And that, in my opinion, lies on the coaching. But at this point, like I said, it's probably too late in the process to do anything about it. All right, Giant fans, coming up next, Mike Kafka is on a audition for the head coaching job. You can't rule him out. So we'll talk a little bit about some other things Kafka maybe needs to show besides the wins and the losses to give himself a legitimate chance to keep the job after this season. Hey, Giant fans, there's nothing like being in the stadium for an NFL game, surrounded by fans cheering on your favorite team. But let's be honest, getting tickets can be a hassle. Between queues, login screens, and prices jumping up at checkout, it's very frustrating. That's why you need to check out Game Time, the app that gives you the advantage back to the fans. Game Time is fast, easy, and backed by the Game Time guarantee. You'll always get 100% authentic tickets delivered on time and at the best prices. Plus, all fees are included so that the price you see is the price you'll pay. Check out their zone deals. You pick the section, and Game Time will pick the seats, and you save big. So go on and take the guesswork out of buying tickets to your favorite events with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the promo code LOCKEDONNFL to get $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Swipe, tap, ticket, go. Download Game Time today. All right, Giant fans, welcome back to Locked On Giants. I'm your host, Patricia Traina. And in this segment, we'll talk a little bit about Mike Kafka. Now, it's interesting. When you see the list of head coaching candidates for the Giants for next year, Kafka's name doesn't come up on the list. And that's because I think a guilt by association. He was part of the Brian Dable era. So therefore, sweep everything out, start fresh, start anew and whatnot. The truth is, folks, Kafka is on an audition. This is a real audition for him. Whether you want to admit it or not, that's where he's at. He has a chance to put himself in the conversation for the next permanent head coach. So that being said, what does Kafka have to do besides obviously wins and losses to get himself an interview and consideration to have the interim title removed from his name? Well, obviously, wins are important, but competitiveness is important. You can't be having collapses. You can't be having blowout losses or lopsided losses, if you will. You've got to be competitive. And you can make the case that so far in the one game, the Giants were competitive with the Packers. Now, it also helped that the Packers had some miscues, which dropped interceptions and stuff. But the Giants, the offense was not bad. I also think that as Kafka goes along, the quicker he finds his own voice, if you will, across the board, the better it's going to serve him. Now, by that, I mean, for years, Kafka did it Brian Dable's way. And Brian Dable's way was how they did things in Buffalo. There was very little from Kansas City, where Kafka came from, that was incorporated with how the Giants ran things. Well, Kafka is now starting to incorporate things from Kansas City that, he learned under Andy Reid. And, oh, by the way, Kansas City has won a few Super Bowls, right, recently. So why not incorporate some of that stuff that works? So some of the things that Kafka's done, he's changed up some practice schedules, some meeting, the order of the events of the day. Obviously, he changed up the day off for the players. So now it's Monday instead of Tuesday. And just little things in terms of, the little behind the scenes operational details. But where Kafka really needs to change things up is in the offensive philosophy. Now, you're not going to change the entire system. You're not going to throw that out at this point. But like I said earlier in the program, you can maybe scale back on the number of design runs. You can maybe incorporate more play action. You can maybe incorporate a lot more 12 personnel or different route concepts that maybe weren't as prevalent with Brian Dable as the head coach. There are different things that he could bring in. And I expect Kafka is going to fully lean on his experiences from, working with Andy Reid, not just in Kansas City, but, back when the two of them were with the Eagles way back in the day when Kafka was a player. So little things like that. And then, of course, there's obviously the accountability, which we saw last week with Abdul Carter and just any other player, and I'm talking not just, indiscretions that happen off the field. I'm talking about If a player isn't giving his all, if he's dogging it out there or mailing it in, sit him down. And we actually saw that last week. I don't know if you guys noticed it, but there were a couple of times when Deonte Banks, and I hate to keep picking on him, but he's the poster boy this year for that, where it looked like he wasn't giving his all. And the coaching staff pulled him off the field and played Corey Black, the rookie, in place of him. Now, do you honestly think that the coaching staff would prefer to do that? I don't, but they were trying to send a message. You either give it your all or you take a seat. So I like that accountability is starting to show up again, because I think some of the accountability in the locker room, just based on, what we've seen over the years, that might have fallen by the wayside. And Kafka's trying to bring that back, and rightfully so. This is his addition. Why have somebody screw it up by, not taking things seriously, by, going about it in a lackadaisical type of way? So I applaud Kafka for that. And I think that's important to him. Also being involved more on special teams and on defense, learning that process, because again, remember, Kafka's primarily been an offensive-minded head coach. He's still learning about, the defensive side, the special team side. And look, he's going to make mistakes along the way. He's not going to be perfect. There were some mistakes he made, I thought, in his debut last week, specific to the challenges or the lack of challenges. But overall, it was a good first try for Kafka. And I think as the weeks go on, it's going to get a little bit better. But unfortunately, the season is so far gone that, it might be hard to justify putting him in the conversation for Giants head coach. Although I do think, again, he will get an interview, if nothing else, as a courtesy. So we'll see how he does this week against Detroit. This is the first road game. We'll see what changes and, how they perform and whatnot. But, it's just, this is where we're at once again. So we'll see how it all rolls out. All right, Giant fans, that's going to do it for this edition of Locked On Giants. As always, thank you for spending part of your day with the Locked On Giants podcast. And if you made us your first listen of the day, we appreciate that as well. For your next listen, get a double dose of the Locked On NFL podcast. Tyler the Madman Rowland gives you a shot of espresso to start your football day, while Tony Wiggins takes you into the barbershop for the smoothest breakdowns to end the day. Find Locked On NFL on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcasts. All right, Giant fans, I'll be back with you on Sunday after the game. I'll have my takeaways. Until then, have a fantastic weekend and go Giants.